Welcome to another episode of the Sefardim Chatter podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by Rabbi Shmuel Reich, ADHD coach and host of the ADHD Heroes podcast. ADHD can impact not only attention, but also memory, organization, and other skills that can affect responsibilities at home, productivity at work, studies for school or yeshiva, or even an adult's personal learning. Rabbi Reich is an experienced ADHD coach who helps adults, teens, and couples create personalized strategies for greater success at work, improve studies, and reclaim shalom bayis. Rabbi Reich can be reached for one-on-one or couples coaching at rsreichadhdcoach@gmail.com. That's rsreichadhdcoach, COACH, @gmail.com. Check out Rabbi Reich's newly released podcast entitled The ADHD Heroes Podcast, in which he interviews professionals who help those with ADHD as well as those with ADHD themselves to learn valuable information, useful tips and strategies, and, most importantly, inspiring stories of success around living and thriving with ADHD. The ADHD Heroes podcast is available on all major podcast platforms. If you would like to share your ADHD story on the ADHD Heroes podcast, you can email Rabbi Reich at adhdheroespodcast@gmail.com. That's ADHDHEROESPODCAST@gmail.com. And you'll find the email links and links to the podcast in the show's notes below. To sponsor an episode or to support the podcast, please email sefarimchatter@gmail.com. See the link and information in the show's notes below. Additionally, you can find the links to the Sefardim Chatter WhatsApp community where I post new books, new Sefardim, book deals, and so on, as well as the links for the Sefardim Chatter YouTube and Substack. And also, wherever, if you can please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, wherever it is you listen, 24/6, Apple, Spotify, and so on. And with that, enjoy the episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Sefardim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, we're going to be joined by Professor Stanley Mirvis, who is an associate professor of history in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies, and the Harold and Jean Grossman Chair of Jewish Studies at Arizona State University. We'll be discussing the Jews of Jamaica and his book that he wrote on this called The Jews of 18th Century Jamaica, a testamentary history of a diaspora in transition. So thank you, Professor Mirvis, for joining me.
Thank you very much, Nachi. I'm very happy to be here.
Okay, so let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
Okay, I went to undergraduate. I had my undergraduate degree from Yeshiva University. I stayed at Yeshiva University to study at Bernard Revel Graduate School of Jewish Studies, and there I got a master's degree in modern Jewish history. Then from there, I went on to the City University of New York, where I got my PhD in history, specializing in Jewish history. And following that, I was a postdoctoral researcher at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. So that's been my sort of academic trajectory. And now I'm here in Arizona at the Arizona State University.
Okay, so the book is about the Jews of Jamaica, and just as a general, Jamaica is at the 18th century. This is the West Indies. We have to explain a little bit to listeners what we're talking about, and especially this is Sephardic Portuguese Jews. But how did you, before you even get there? I mean, how did you get to the Jews of Jamaica? How did you decide to research and write on this?
Yeah, well, I'd always been interested in the Sephardic experience. I myself am not Sephardi. I am a Lithuanian Ashkenazi, like us all. But I had a deep interest in Sephardic history, particularly in the West. And when I had started my PhD program, I was very interested in writing about the Chida, Chaim Yosef David Azalai, his Ma'agal Tov, and his travel log. And that's what my plan was. And my doctoral advisor, Jane Gerber, who is the great scholar of Jews in Spain and the Sephardic diasporas, suggested that I go to Jamaica to look at some archives there and explore the Sephardi diasporas in the Americas. And I did that, and it just kind of changed the course of what I wrote about. So really, it was a Seilach Harav, and that's what I did, and that helped me to, guided me towards the Caribbean.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the Caribbean. Let's talk about, I don't know, maybe I guess, let's first give let's do it this way. Let's give first a little bit of an overview on the Western Sephardic diaspora, Sephardic Portuguese. What do we mean by that? And then we'll focus in on the West Indies and Jamaica in particular.
Okay, yeah. So in 1492, we can start there. It was a big year in Jewish history, and several 100,000 Jews crossed the border of Portugal to remain Jewish. And let's say about 200,000 or so, the numbers are a little unclear, converted, became conversos, stayed in Spain. And they joined conversos that had already been there. But now you have this big cohort in Portugal. And the Jews that go to Portugal in 1492 were really had a very unusual experience because they had been among the most committed Jews. They had refused to convert. Their ancestors did not convert in 1390. They didn't convert in 1414. They stayed Jewish, and they stayed Jewish in 1492. And so when they crossed the border, you have the very committed Jews living in Portugal. On top of that, the conditions of a Portuguese expulsion were very different. It was very abrupt, and the Jews in Portugal were just converted in mass in 1497. So there was no actual expulsion from Portugal. But what that meant is all these very committed Jews just became conversos overnight. So very different conditions in Spain. And on top of that, there was no Inquisition in Portugal until 1536. That meant there was about a 40-year amnesty where no one was looking at what they were doing as conversos. So what that means is it allows the conditions for real crypto-Judaism, what we call Marianism, to really exist in Portugal, whereas that kind of disappears a little bit in Spain. So you have this. So this creates two different kinds of Sephardi diasporas. There's the Sephardi diaspora of the Midrashim, those that about 20,000 or so that go to Morocco, those that go to Portugal and then end up in the Ottoman Empire, or from North Africa go to the Ottoman Empire, where there they continue to speak Ladino, where they really develop Ladino, and they refer to themselves as Sefardim. So that is they're still speaking in Spanish. There's a sense of kind of ethnic supremacy in a way, or ethnic distinctiveness when they're dealing with Maghrebi Jews in North Africa, or Romaniote Jews in the Balkans. And that's what sometimes is called the Eastern Sephardi diaspora. Now the Western Sephardi diaspora is a very different character. So it's Portuguese speaking. The minutes are kept in Portuguese. The sermons are in Portuguese. There's no Ladino, or very, very little Ladino being spoken, although Spanish is in circulation in the Portuguese diaspora. And I think the key difference here is that almost everybody in the Portuguese diaspora had once been conversos, unlike some people in the Sephardi diaspora. So in the different locations, so in the Portuguese diaspora, really develops around Amsterdam and Western Europe and Hamburg and then London, and then extends to the Caribbean, first in Brazil, and then on to some parts of the French Caribbean, Guadeloupe and Martinique, and then to Jamaica and Barbados and Curacao and Suriname, and ultimately to North America. So this is what we call the Portuguese or the Western Sephardi diaspora. So they're very distinct. And you don't see Portuguese Jews of the Western Sephardi diaspora really referring to themselves as Sephardim. They'll call themselves Portuguese, or men of a nation, or men of lineage, or things like that. They have a little different character. They'd all kind of gone through this process of transition. Now, that said, East and West, and I'll in my answer here, East and West are not mutually exclusive categories here. A lot of the rabbis that are serving in the West are really counterflows that come from the East, like Josiah Pardo, whose family had come from Salonika into Italy and then settled in Amsterdam, or Joshua Zakai de Cordova, also from an Ottoman family. So the Portuguese diaspora is very dependent on the expertise of Jews from the Ottoman world in North Africa in order to have any kind of real knowledge of what Rabbinic Judaism is, since they had all been conversos. And similarly, there are lots of Portuguese Jews who end up in the Ottoman world, like Doña Gracia Nasi very famously ends up there. And so East and West I try to avoid the terminology of East and West because it's it's a little bit more confusing than that. Yeah.
Okay, so for the listeners, I mean, obviously this is not a podcast just about Sephardic Portuguese, although it should be one eventually on that. And there's some good books, and maybe you can recommend that people want to learn more about them. But some of this is discussed in your book, obviously, because that's mainly who's in Jamaica. We'll get to the Ashkenazim at a certain point in Jamaica, but this is mainly who was there, and the Caribbean and the West Indies. So I mean, let's talk about, so now how did they apply to Jamaica? I mean, you mentioned Brazil, the Recife is obviously the first place, but that they were in South America, but in the Caribbean. But how did they, I mean, where was Jamaica, first of all, among when the Jews got there, as opposed to, I guess, other islands and other places? And when, just talk about just a brief overview of Jamaican history of Jamaica as in general, what is necessary as it applies to the Jews, and then we'll get a little bit more specific.
Oh, yes, certainly. Yeah. So Jamaica is a little bit late to the party because it was Spanish. And so, Jews can't settle in the Spanish world. And it becomes British in 1655, roughly around the same time when Menashe ben Israel is petitioning Oliver Cromwell. Now, that's a failed attempt too, right? The assembly in Whitehall did not, in the end, readmit Jews. But at the same time that the British Empire was really extending into the Caribbean and what was called the Western Design, Jamaica became British, which meant that it gave a safe haven for some Jews to land. Now, you don't start to see Jews really until the 1660s, and then you only see individual Jews, individual Jewish prospectors that are trying to leverage discovery of minerals for some kind of status, citizenship, of denization, some kind of settlement right. And then around the 1670s is when you start to see a full-fledged community developing there. Now, they're Portuguese. They are led by Portuguese regents, but they're, of course, Ashkenazim close on their heels, as in all parts of the Portuguese diaspora. And so the real gravity of settlement for Jews in this very early period is in Port Royal, which was a major trading port that had been kind of neglected by the Spanish, and then the British turned it into this really important trading hub. And then Port Royal was destroyed in 1692. And then Jews sort of gravitate towards the mainland of Jamaica, to Spanish Town and to Kingston. And that's really where the rest of Jewish history in Jamaica develops, is in those big cities. And then they play a major role in both the trade economy and the plantation economy as you're moving into the 1740s and 50s. In the 1770s and 80s, there's some tensions with the Jewish community that are sparked by numerous different historical factors because of the rejudaization process, where Jews are going over the border, crossing into of Spain, that is, and crossing into France. Almost everybody in the Portuguese diaspora has some connection to Bayonne or to Bordeaux or to the southern part of France. And so that put Jews in a little bit of a precarious position in the British Empire that's at war with the French in the 1750s to the early 1760s. So these are some of the things that Jews navigate when they're living in Jamaica. And then ultimately in 1826, they're granted suffrage. So in Jewish terminology, they're emancipated. That's how it's referred to in Jewish studies. But that emancipation is kind of obstructed by a clause that required it to be approved by the crown. So even though they were granted emancipation in 1826, it wasn't actually in effect until 1831. And then you start to see Jews really starting to participate in government in the 1840s and 50s. So that's a kind of really broad brushstroke of Jewish settlement in Jamaica.
Okay, so first of all, also just mention that the diaspora or Spanish Portuguese, they were engaged a lot in trade, right? So they were merchants. That's why it was so important for them to be in the West Indies and the Caribbean. And that's why they were, you mentioned when they started out of it. So we'll get to Jamaica in a second. I do want to mention, because I think it's important, that your book mainly you mentioned that there really was a lack of sources here. I mean, and you therefore you use a lot of wills, probate wills. So why was there such a lack of sources? And first, why is there such a lack of sources here?
So that's a great question. In general, there is not a lack of sources for the Portuguese diaspora. They're actually very well documented. So London has extensive sources. Amsterdam has very robust communal sources. So it's not specific to the Portuguese diaspora, but rather only Jamaica. So Suriname, starting a little bit later, also has a lot of communal records and things like that, and intercommunal exchange. And Jamaica had all of that. but it was lost in a fire in Kingston in 1882. So those communal records were gone. So they began to keep records again after 1882, which were again lost in 1907 when a major earthquake destroyed Kingston. So now Barbados is a little different. Barbados, it happened in Barbados too, but then when they started keeping their minutes in the 18th century, late 18th century, they later sent those minutes to London to the Metropolitan Archives there for safekeeping. So there's more communal records from Barbados, but in Jamaica, you're really having to work with either what's there in the regular archives, because there are no specifically Jewish archives that have survived, or you have to kind of work from the metropolitan side. That is, go to London or go to Amsterdam and look at those records and see if there are capedores de cartas or like these collections of letters and things like that that are unidirectional, really only looking at the West Indies from the perspective of the metropole of the European city. So that's what's available, and that's why I gravitated towards probate wills, because they're abundant.
So that's it. First of all, like you keep saying, so London, obviously, with the crown at that point, with England being in charge of Jamaica, the London community obviously was like the main community, so to speak. They're very connected and with Amsterdam. So, I mean, you say you use wills, probate wills. I mean, what is a probate will? Explain what that means and why you decide to use these as your sources.
Yeah. So when someone is getting older, or if they're sick, and for whatever reason they feel like death is imminent, they will start to write down the ways that they want their properties to be distributed. Now they do this as a kind of individualism and a kind of freedom, because if you die without a will, then the state will determine, just like today, the state will determine how to divvy up your estate, and that's called intestacy. So that is why people made wills. So most people did not make wills, by the way. Most people in the Caribbean, most Jews, and most people in general are not the rich planters that are, growing fat on the sugar, but they are rather very poor and indigent people. A lot of them had been dispatched by the communities in London or Amsterdam, because that is given a travel grant to go to the Caribbean, because they had arrived there penniless, having been suspected by the Inquisitions in Portugal or Spain. So we're talking about a community that's mostly poor. And so most the Jews in the Caribbean and in Jamaica do not make wills, because they don't have significant properties to divvy up. Or also, even if they do, they may not make a will, because they could just die intestate, and the government will give 1/3 of their estate to their wife, and then that's the law. So really, wills are very limited for that reason. And another avenue here is that most the Portuguese Jewish communities in the world, be it Livorno, which is a very big one in Italy, or in Amsterdam, you could also file your will with the Jewish community. And so I assume that happened in Jamaica too, and those are lost. So that's just to acknowledge the limits of wills. But what a probate will is basically a legal document, not a intellectual document or an ego document, or it doesn't give you any kind of indication about people's beliefs or their values or their anything like that. Or it's simply like, I give this to this person, this to this person, this to that person. Sometimes there's conditions in them. If this person does this, then he'll get that. But if that person doesn't do this, then they won't get that. That becomes kind of interesting. But you really do get if you read enough of them and put enough of them together, you can kind of get a sense of a community. The way I think of a will is kind of the intersection of the individual with a family, but also a family with a community, and then a community within a whole diaspora. Because what you see in the wills in Jamaica is that people are not that localized in Jamaica until later, but are rather very connected to other parts of the Western Sephardi diaspora.
So how do you use these wills now to construct, the historical book and in your research?
I pick at certain elements. That's one example I just gave. Now I want to know what was the relationship between Jamaica and the rest of the diaspora, and I can measure that, maybe not in a perfect way, but something that can be measured by a will, by calculating how much inheritance was sent to what parts of the Caribbean. Like, where were the beneficiaries to the estate? Which suggests to me the more beneficiaries that are outside of Jamaica might suggest that there's a more of diasporic focus among the Jews of Jamaica. And as that diminishes, you might suggest that they're becoming more localized. And they're only giving inheritance to people living there in Jamaica. So that's one kind of example of what I can do. But also there's a lot of elements in wills that are suggestive of communal piety, which helped me to make some claims about what communal Jewish life was like. Donations to synagogues, giving earmarking funds for hashkava, for what they call escavot in the Portuguese inflection, or to communal charities, what kind of confraternities were operating there, because people will give bequests to like the Gamil Chasadim or to the Chevra Kadisha or something like that. And so you can get a pretty robust sense of what communal Jewish life looked like. And it tells you a lot about the Jewish interaction with slave society, because they'll bequeath slaves. They will talk about their relationships with slaves, their children with slaves. So all of those things are deeply embedded in wills. And so if you can read enough of them and you can pick at these parts, then you can start to construct a pretty significant communal history just from a legal document. It's a difficult process because you have to read against the grain of the formulaic legal notarial language, because the probate wills are not written in the hand of the testator themselves. They're written by notaries, so they're copied by notaries. So they're kind of removed from the voice of the testators themselves. So there's a lot of tricks with wills, and some confounds, that is, and historical problems that need to be addressed and kind of controlled for in order to make any kind of claim with them.
Okay, so interesting. So now getting back to the book and the actual Jamaica. So first of all, as you mentioned already, and mainly the community first and started in Port Royal, which maybe people are familiar with from Pirates and Pirates of the Caribbean. I guess it's a kind of a famous or infamous kind of city. But so talk about Port Royal and the town, and then its Jewish population, and then obviously, we'll get to the destruction.
Yeah, you're right to say that Port Royal is famous for its pirate haven, and there is that element to it. Although it should be noted that piracy was very illegal, and after 1680, really there isn't a significant use of privateering or anything like that. And really, it was a place with a lot of rule of law, And so when you look deeper into it, it wasn't exactly the swashbuckling Errol Flynn or Johnny Depp image that we might have. That said, it was unruly in its own ways, but so was New York, and maybe New York was even more so in this period. And so, but really, it was a place of a lot of diversity, ethnic and religious. The British had a specific policy. The Crown government of Jamaica had a articulate policy, explicit policy of religious tolerance that extended even to Catholics, which was pretty extreme, and also extended to Jews and to Protestant dissenters like Quakers or Huguenot or people like that. So it really was a place of many different churches and ethnicities and faiths, all kind of in this little town. Now, it was a hard place to live because it didn't even have its own source of fresh water. All of that had to be imported from the Jamaican mainland, and also almost all their food stuff was being imported from other Caribbean islands in North America. So it was a hard place to live, but we want to kind of we want to be careful about some of the conceptions of Port Royal as being a place that can't be civilized, as being this unruly haven. And a lot of that mythology comes from the period itself, from European observers and travelers who were going there, and that was their experience. Now, it was destroyed in 1692. So there was probably a synagogue there. We have no archaeological reason to think that, because half the city was drowned in a tsunami as a result of a massive earthquake in 1692. There's actually an interesting or interesting correspondence between the London community and, I believe, Salonika, where they informed I think Yehuda Galante, one of the rabbis in Salonika, about the death toll, the Jewish death toll in Port Royal. So this is a very globalized world that they were living in, and the Sephardi diasporas were more interconnected than we think in that sense. And it really resulted in Jews kind of leaving Port Royal, but there was always a connection to it even after 1692. They rebuilt the synagogue there for sure at some point in the 18th century, because there were donations to it and wills. Some families stayed very attached to Port Royal. And also, when there were debates in the assembly of whether or not to rebuild Port Royal, Jews were among some of the most important signatories. So Jews were very connected to Port Royal, and even though really their location, Kingston, becomes really the main urban concentration of Jews, and most Jews in Jamaica are urban dwellers, even those that have big plantations, maybe in rural parts of the island, usually still live in Kingston and invest in Kingston properties, and it's really a minority, very few that actually live on rural plantations, although some do.
I think you mentioned in the book, was there a cemetery in Port Royal, or was right nearby a Jewish cemetery?
It's nearby. It's still there, actually. It was across. So Port Royal is like this kind of a, like when you land in Jamaica today, the airport's near Port Royal, and you kind of go and you can see like you're on this very thin strip of land with the sea on either side. And so it is it makes like a semicircle around Kingston Harbor. So on the other side of the harbor from Port Royal is Kingston, and today in the now consumed by sprawling Kingston is a neighborhood that's called the Ligony Plain, and there was a cemetery. So the Jews, like in Amsterdam, the Jews at Port Royal would ferry their dead to across the harbor and bury them at Hunts Bay Cemetery. And they were doing that in the 1670s, even though they didn't have a deed for the land until the 1730s. So, but a cemetery is the first requirement of the Jewish community. Before you get a synagogue or anything else, you need a place to bury the dead. So yeah, that's Hunts Bay Cemetery.
Right. So you mentioned the destruction of Port Royal, and in the book you do even go more in depth on how that affected the Jews and how obviously that destroyed the community there. So did you want to tell some specific figures? But before that, you mentioned Kingston, right? So let's talk about Kingston. So how did the Jewish community in Kingston start? And I guess what's something interesting maybe also is how big were these communities? I mean, obviously we don't have how many back.
They're not huge. They're not huge. So to put it into perspective, the climax of the Jewish community in the 18th century is about 1,000 Jews, and that's not huge. And it's even in Caribbean terms, because Curacao was maybe closer to 2,000 at some points, and Suriname may have reached about 1,500 at some points. Although I do think in the late 18th century, Suriname and Jamaica were about on par, even though Suriname had in a lot of ways more established Jewish life than did Jamaica. But to put it into perspective, even though those numbers seem small, there's more Jews in Kingston alone than all of North America in the 18th century. So so really the gravity of Jewish life in the colonial period is the Caribbean. And even if it's numerically small, it's very deeply connected to a wider diaspora. And so, Jews in Jamaica are moving around a lot. A lot of them go back to London. And so there's a lot of absenteeism. So they'll invest in Jamaica and then go live in London, which is a general process that's happening among other planters as well. So Yeah, and there's a lot of shuffling of communities, especially the poor, between Suriname, Barbados, and Jamaica. So it's hard to get a grasp at the actual numbers at any given time, since it was such a fluid kind of region of of settlement. But Kingston is a really interesting place because about 1704 they built a synagogue there, and then it was significantly renovated in 1760s. And in the 1790s, you have a pretty large Jewish community in Kingston, a very large investment in the real estate of Kingston by Jews, which was very significant, probably more than most places on earth. And interesting about Kingston is that Jews were really localized in the southwestern part of the city near the docks. And that's exactly where the free people of color lived. So slaves are emancipated, either they purchase their own freedom or they're emancipated in a will, manumitted in a will. So they're given their freedom by an owner in a will, or they are, or you can file for manumission. You could go to the government office and pay for an act of manumission. So those are the ways that slaves could become free. And the free people of color in Jamaica who could stay there without any restriction, unlike parts of North America where you could only, if you were freed, like in South Carolina, if you were freed, you could only live there for about 6 months and then you had to leave. They didn't want permanent free people of color residing there. But in Jamaica, you could. So and Kingston's a really interesting place because Jews and free people of color are living in the exact same neighborhood. And because of that, partially because of that, there's a deep interconnectedness between the free people of color and the Jews in Jamaica, especially since they're living together in very close quarters in Kingston, but they also have almost identical civil disabilities. They can both bring cases to court, they can both own land, they can both own slaves, but neither can serve in government or vote in elections. And in fact, they both get the same right in 1831. So Jews, the fate of Jews and free people of color are very much entangled, especially in Kingston.
So so something else interesting you mentioned a couple of times about plantations and the plantation economy. I mean, what does that mean in Jamaica? What was Jamaica's economy at this time, and how involved were the Jews in these plantations?
Yeah, so Jews are by and large merchants. Now one of the arguments I make in my book is that we've been overly attached to the term merchant. And that's a product of our sources. So you look at tombstones, they're called merchants, and you look at their wills, they're usually called merchants. Sometimes they'll be called planters. And that's what the notaries call them. It's not what they call it themselves. But what I found is, really, there's not such a strict divide between being a merchant and being a planter. Some merchants invest their profits into plantations. But generally speaking, the economy of Jamaica really changes dramatically around 1740. What had been a very diverse set of commodities that were being traded, and importing of finished products from Europe, and then reselling them throughout the whole Caribbean, and also producing indigo and producing cotton. These kind of things were really key in early history of Jamaica. But around 1740, there is an attempt by the Assembly of Jamaica to really push a monoculture production, which is just producing one cash crop, and that crop is sugar. So that's when you start to see also really the acceleration of the slave regime to produce sugar, which was a very inhumane kind of commodity to produce because it grows very high. It takes a lot of labor. It's very dangerous work. It has to be chopped. It has to be the cane fields have to be burned so that you can replant them. And then the process of refining raw sugarcane into molasses in order to produce rum, which was the chief product here, was very dangerous work and labor-intensive work. So it really fueled the slave labor economy. So the Jewish planters, of which they're a minority, but there are several, maybe not like in Suriname, when you had a whole village of just Jewish planters, Yod and Savannah. But Jews were very much invested in participants in the plantation economy, and which meant also in the slave regime.
Right. So obviously, like you said, you discuss this more at length in the book. Jews being involved in the slave market and in the slave market, meaning being owners. So something else that you mentioned. I guess this goes together with there was a lot of anti-Semitism though in Jamaica, and you discussed what that is and why that is, and then they ended up with the Plantation Act, and somehow they ended up getting citizenship, which they did not really have before that. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's a really confusing thing, the Plantation Act. So in 1740, the Parliament in England decided to incentivize settlement in the Caribbean and in any parts of the British Empire. So they granted naturalization to anyone that could that had resided in 7 years or made a pledge to reside for 7 years in any one of their colonies. And the Jews in Jamaica, more than any other British colony, filed for this status. Now, this was a big shift because beforehand they could become denizen, which was a status that they could purchase in the island itself. But being denizen really just gave you access to the courts in order to let you trade, because you can't trade if you can't go to court. And so if they wanted the Jewish merchants to help to fuel the economy, they had to allow Jews to arbitrate disputes in court. So that was really what denization gave you, and it gave you the right to own land and slaves. But it was not inherited in perpetuity, so your children would also have to file for the status of denizens. And also, Jews are considered foreigners. And they are foreigners in the English world. They speak Portuguese mostly. Their families live in Bayonne still in France. So they are really kind of others in the English world. And so they have to pay foreign tariffs, even though they are denizen. Now, being naturalized gets you away from a lot of these things. But being naturalized before required a specific act of parliament, which was very expensive, very hard to obtain, had to be done in England. So very few Jews actually had that status beforehand. Now in 1740, the situation changes whereby, just by living in the Caribbean, you could be fully naturalized. And so this was exciting to a lot of Jews, of course, who took advantage of this. And the expectation was that this would give them full emancipation, but it didn't. And that's where it gets really tricky. And by the way, the 1740 Plantation Act was controversial in England too, but it passed. Now it created these paths of confusion because let's say in 1750. You have someone like Abraham Sanchez Morel who had been naturalized by the Plantation Act in 1740. He decides that he wants to vote for his member of assembly. And so he goes in St. John, in this kind of smaller parish, he goes and he casts his vote defiantly for a member of assembly. Now, this happened also, the free people of color were doing the same thing because they were also denied the right to vote. And also some Jews in New York were doing the same thing too in the 1770s, like just casting their vote. So this was a trend. The Jewish community in London did not like him doing that, seemingly because they didn't put him in cherem, but they censored him for this kind of maybe rocking the boat too much. Let's just do this gradually, I think was their perspective. And the Sanchez Morel case was quite problematic because it forced the issue in the assembly. The Jews thought that since they had been naturalized by 1740 Act, that they could now vote in elections and serve in the assembly. No way. That's not what we meant. And so the assembly really starts to promulgate very anti-Semitic legislation, rhetoric, even though it was the end of a discriminatory tax that had existed earlier. So it's a little bit complicated. But the tricky thing is when we get to emancipation, because when actual emancipation in 1826, when the assembly votes for the right of Jews to passes Jewish voting rights, but then an obstructionist amendment was attached to that said it had to be approved by the king. And the king at the time in England said, hey, we already did this in 1740. So they obstructed it further, saying by the 1740 Act, we already gave the Jews the right to vote. But that was denied by the Assembly of Jamaica. So that's their problem. It's not our problem. So the effect of that was that the actual voting rights in Jamaica were not in effect until 1831, even though they had passed in 1826. That this, I think, is a great illustration of how confusing the Plantation Act is to us, and it was to them too. Like now that you're naturalized, what is your what's different about your status than if you had just been denizen, except you were now not paying high tariffs. It seemed it was the end of the Jewish tax, and it also meant that your children could inherit that status.
Okay, so like I said, in the book, you do discuss more about anti-Semitic remarks, anti-Semitic governors, anti-Semitic travelers. That's the amazing thing about Jamaica, and I think it forces us to qualify assumptions that we might have about Jews in the Americas, kind of having this, exceptional path towards equality and having gone to the Americas, freed them of the kind of prejudices of Europe. And that's a very that's a very inaccurate way of looking at it, because in a lot of ways Jamaican Jews were more discriminated against than they were in London. There was no Jewish tax in London, but there was in Jamaica. And as you get deeper into the 18th century, closer to the moment of emancipation, and this was true in Suriname too, you really see the anti-Semitic rhetoric in the public sphere. So in like printed sources, really, I think accelerating and becoming and ballooning into fever pitch. So example is when the uncle of Moses Montefiore, Joshua Montefiore, showed up in Jamaica to practice law, and he was already practicing as a solicitor in England, which had been allowed. Not a barrister. Jews couldn't be barristers, and that's not explicitly by law, but because by barrister I mean someone arguing a case in court. And that wasn't explicit by law, but just because the various inns of court, as they're called, or the various clubs that gave you access to be a barrister wouldn't include Jews. So when Joshua Montefiore went to Jamaica to practice law, 60 attorneys brought a suit against him that he can't practice law because he was a Jew. And it was a really interesting case because they brought the evidence that was being heard in court was whether or not Jews were practicing law in London or not, and if they should do that, and if they should do it in Jamaica. So I think that's a really good example of the kind of discrimination that was felt. In the 1780s, there was some violence against the synagogue on Yom Kippur. It was not a place free of anti-Semitism. And therein lies some of the dialectic here, like the contradictory elements of life in the Atlantic, right? Jews are persecuted in the Caribbean. They can't serve in government. They can't vote in elections. They have discriminatory taxation. They're facing the same kind of anti-Semitic rhetoric, sometimes even worse than what they're facing in Europe. On the other hand, they're also empowered in ways that are unthinkable to a lot of Jews in Europe, right? They can own other people. They have mastery over slaves. And from an enslaved perspective, there's really no difference, I don't think, between being owned by a Jew or being owned by a non-Jew, because all the evidence shows that Jews are neither kinder nor more brutal to their slaves than anybody else, even though that is a kind of theme that comes out of the colonial period in the Caribbean, and Suriname especially, the accusation that Jews are more brutal, which is a kind of anti-Semitism. Like in Suriname, you'll see like the only reason that slaves are revolting and forming maroon communities is because the Jews are forcing them because they're more brutal. And there's the same accusation given against the free people of color. So you have like white Christian planters. They're saying the reason that we have problems in our slave regime is because Jews and free people of color are brutal to their slaves. So that's anti-Semitic, and racist and prejudicial. So, there's a strange balancing act here. Jews are both disempowered and empowered in ways that are very fascinating in the Caribbean. Right. So what I wanted to get to, I didn't mention earlier, I know this is earlier on in the book, but the Rabbanim, the rabbis of Jamaica. So the first rabbi in Jamaica was a pretty famous, I guess, famous. People, probably none of the listeners really heard of him, but I guess someone. He wasn't just like somebody. Rabbi Josiah Pardo. He was there very shortly. He was Rabbi David Pardo of Amsterdam, which is not probably the David Pardo everybody's thinking of. That's the one who wrote the Tosefta and other stuff. That's a different one. That was a different Pardo. And I mentioned to you before we got on that in this new Machon Yerushalayim has the Kisvei Rabbi Yitzchak Afo of Dafanseka, Chachme Recifi Amsterdam. There's the second volume has some Shelos Teshuvos from him, and the third volume has Rabbi Yosha Pardo, and the third volume has now 28 drasha sermons that he gave.
That's really great. Yeah, and those are probably translated from the Portuguese.
Yeah, I believe so. So, I mean, who was he, and how did he end up being the rabbi in Jamaica?
Yeah, really cool. So this actually is my next major research project. I'm writing a book now about that I call the Atlantic Rabbinate. So I'm really interested in the creation of a rabbinic class that was distinctive in the Atlantic world in the 18th century between Amsterdam, London, and the New World and the Caribbean. So I'm really interested. I'm glad that you asked this question right now. And so Josiah Pardo, Josiah Pardo is an interesting character. He was, like, as you said, the son of David Pardo, who was a major rabbinic figure in Amsterdam. Now, Amsterdam was a crowded field of rabbis because it was not only was it farming rabbis like Shalevi Mortiera from Italy, who was really like the chief rabbi, the principal rabbi there, an Ashkenazi, a student of Leone Modena from Venice. And but also it was home growing their own rabbis. So the Eitz Chaim Academy in Amsterdam was producing rabbis from conversos. So people like Yitzhak Abba Fonseca, you just mentioned, or Menashe ben Israel, were born as conversos in Portugal and were trained at Eitz Chaim and became rabbis, and that's an incredible thing. And so these rabbis were really valuable because they were experts in the rejudaization process. They could go help others rejudaize. So in the Americas, that was especially important. In Brazil, as you're referring to, when Yitzhak Abba de Fonseca and Moses Rafael de Aguilar are there, they're helping with the rejudaization process because you have hundreds of conversos that were living under the Portuguese that are now transitioning to rabbinic Judaism. And they need rabbinic expertise. And not only that, but someone who understands what they're going through. Because it's a very specific and unique process of being a new Christian and becoming a new Jew, as Yosef Kaplan calls it. So so that's really critical in the role of rabbis in the New World. So that is something that that Josiah Pardo is working on. But he also seems to be somewhat stuck on the bottom rungs of the rabbinate in the Netherlands. He serves in Rotterdam. He has a really famous rabbi father, and there ends up being a crowded field. So that might explain why he goes to Curacao. And there he has a pretty long career in Curacao. We know that he establishes an Erev there. He builds an academy, Eitz Chaim, that was supposed to be a model of what was going on in Amsterdam. And then probably because of a conflict with the Ma'amad, with the communal board, he ends up in Jamaica, and then he dies after a year. That's his story.
Interesting. You said he had a famous father. His father was one of the big rabbis in Amsterdam. His father-in-law also. He had a famous shver. His father-in-law was
his father-in-law was the big rabbi, Shalevi Mortiera. Exactly. So those are big shoes to fill. And there's I think you can speculate on some psychological dimensions here why someone might want to make their own path. And the Caribbean was rather open. But he wasn't the only. Very shortly after, Eliel Lopez ends up in Curacao and then in Barbados. So also someone born as a converso and then trains at Eitz Chaim Academy. But Curacao always has a rabbinic presence. Raphael Yeshurun, and also his name is Saul Mendes. It's Saul Mendes de Sola, is that who is I'm blanking on his name now, but he is a kind of very irascible guy and serves in Curacao. The point here being that and this is what I'm interested in my new book, is we really need to rethink our perceptions of what rabbinic culture looks like in the Americas, because the general perception is that you don't start to see rabbinic authority in the Americas until about 1840. when the German migrants come, and people like Isaac Leeser and Max Lilienthal and a major actually academy trained rabbis show up in North America. But I think by looking at the Sephardic experience, by opening it up to Atlantic perspective, we can kind of push the boundaries of the periodization of the rabbinic culture. So you always have Eitz Chaim trained rabbis serving in the Caribbean. And on top of that, you also have the Shadarim, so shlichim that are being sent by the regents in Istanbul, by the Pikadei Kushta, are traveling the world, but they're also showing up in the Americas. And so you have the most famous of them is Chaim Yitzchak Karigal, who is in Newport, and he has this discussion with the founder of Yale, Ezra Stiles. But he also serves in Suriname and in Jamaica, and he dies in Barbados, and his tombstone is there. So here's someone from Hebron whose tombstone is in Barbados. So they are a major element of rabbinic authority in the early period. And then Jamaica, I'll say this: Jamaica especially benefits from very stable rabbinic leadership because they have a rabbi that serves for over 40 years. So Joshua Hezekiah de Cordova, who was also a student at the Eitz Chaim Academy, but also a bit of a toying with some of the ideas of enlightenment, had studied with Isaac de Pinto, a famous Jewish enlightenment figure in France and in Amsterdam. And he comes to Jamaica and he writes literature that is meant to counteract the effects of radical enlightenment on the Jewish community. A kind of reconciliation of reason and faith, and he advocates for a more Maimonidean approach to reconciling reason and faith, but not embracing the kind of radical ideas of the French philosophers and the Enlightenment. So, but it's key. You have really stable rabbinic leadership who is looking after Shechita. We know that because he's also writing letters to the communal board in New York, complaining about the rigidity with which they're shipping kosher meat to Jamaica. And Jamaica also has its own butchers, at least two of them in Spanish Town and in Kingston. So we might assume that there was a Beit Din in Jamaica that could act independently of London. And I think it's kind of telling, and it doesn't necessarily mean this, but after Joshua Hezekiah de Cordova takes over in Jamaica in 1755, you stop seeing the London community involved in intercommunal issues, which might suggest that there is a kind of transference of power and more autonomy because of stable rabbinic leadership. So, this makes Jamaica a pretty good place to be if you need a stable rabbinic presence.
So interesting. Also, another one of the Rabbanim in New York, in America, maybe Abraham Rice. I mean, so I know, but like you're saying, it's a very interesting project. Your new book. I was going to ask you at the end what it is you're working on next, but I guess that's the answer. So that's a very, very interesting as well. So something that we mentioned earlier was, what about Ashkenazim in Jamaica? I mean, so far we've just been talking about Sefardim. Were there Ashkenazim in Jamaica?
Yeah, so very few, and that's not to say that there weren't significant numbers of Ashkenazim in the Caribbean. So a place like Suriname has quite a large community of Ashkenazim, and in Paramaribo, which is the capital of Suriname, there's an independent Ashkenazi community in 1734. So it establishes itself as independent from the Portuguese Board of Regents in Paramaribo. And also in St. Eustatius, Statia, there is a significant Dutch island, a significant population of Ashkenazim. But in Jamaica, there's very few, and they don't have any kind of communal autonomy until the late 18th century, until the late 1780s and 1790s, when they established their own synagogues and with their own, so that they can pray in their own right and also collect their own tax revenue. And that's the big issue here. More importantly than praying in their own right is being able to support their own indigent. And I also believe, and this might be anecdotal, but my sources, I think, suggest that there's a sort of an Ashkenazi enclave surrounding a single individual who live in a rival city to Kingston, so in Black River Bay, in Westmoreland Parish, which is the west coast of Jamaica, as opposed to Kingston, which is on the east coast of Jamaica. There is a small community of like almost exclusively Ashkenazim. Now they're Ashkenazi slavers, and they're connected to other parts of the world. But I think it's interesting that it would suggest that they already thought, really sought for themselves a kind of independence from the Portuguese regents in Kingston or in Spanish Town. Now that said, here's the thing: Portuguese Jews in general are very dependent on Ashkenazim for knowledge of Rabbinic Judaism, right? And so that's true even in the founding of Amsterdam. In the founding of Amsterdam, they were dependent on Uri of Emden, I think his name was, who was key in establishing the community in Amsterdam, because Ashkenazim had not had that interrupted connection to Judaism as the Portuguese had. And so the Ashkenazim are very interwoven here, but there's some ethnic tensions. The Portuguese see themselves as being ethnically superior in a lot of ways, partially because they had been the beneficiaries in their mind of the great luminaries of the Spanish tradition of Shmuel HaNagid and Yehuda HaLevi and Maimonides, and the Ashkenazim in their mind are kind of backwards, and especially this is especially important when after Tachvatat, Gezerah Tachvatat in 1648, 1649, when you have about 30,000 refugees from Poland in the Ukraine, and a lot of them are showing up in Amsterdam seeking communal support. And so it really creates a lot of tensions between the embedded Portuguese and the Ashkenazi newcomers. But here's the thing: in Jamaica, the community is so little that what I found is that Ashkenazim are really interwoven into the fabric of the community. And a good example of this is Mare Leone, who is an opera singer and the chazan for the Ashkenazi community in London. And he got in trouble with the communal board in London for singing, opera music that had some Christian themes. And he left, and he was also then performing in an English language opera. So he goes to Jamaica, which has a very burgeoning opera culture in Spanish Town, and he probably goes to be a singer in the opera, but he becomes the chazan at the same time as Joshua Zekai de Cordova is the rabbi. And so at the Portuguese synagogue in Kingston, the cantor is this Ashkenazi Mare Leone, who is not just any cantor, but the greatest cantor around. And so, that tells you a lot. Now, when he's a shaliach tzibur, you have to imagine he's doing it in the Portuguese rite, and not in his Ashkenazi rite. So that tells you about the deep level of integration between the two communities.
Right. So I wanted to mention, first of all, I forgot to mention this. Obviously, I will put a link to the to purchase the book in the show's notes. And the book also, like throughout the book, there are a lot more examples, like what you're saying, where you actually show how you use these wills. I know we didn't do much on the podcast, where you show how you examples from the wills and Jewish communal life. And, like you mentioned in the beginning, this one left this amount of money to this one and what they left and slaves, or if they manumitted the slaves. You talk about a lot of that. You talk about the communal life. Then just to finish out, there's a couple other the end chapters in the book that we didn't really get to. Was there's discussion of Jewish physicians in Jamaica, and then you talk about the interesting part of ethnic identity of the Jewish households in Jamaica and Creole Jewish families. So those are things. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit on that.
Yeah. So the ethnic identity is really key here, because the Portuguese, as I said before, really consider themselves to be ethnically distinct from other Jews. An example is marrying an Ashkenazi is very taboo for the Portuguese and can get you in a lot of trouble. So they don't even want you marrying Ashkenazim. It could, and so there really is an attempt to preserve the endogamous nature of the Portuguese diaspora. Now, this is because of a sense of like blood purity, but it's also because of trade, right? They want to preserve family wealth. So it's common for Portuguese, as it is for Ashkenazim, to marry within families, to marry consanguinely, so marry cousins marrying each other, or some cases an uncle marrying a niece, and that's relatively common. But what's even more common is, unlike in North America at the time, the rates of endogamy, that is internally marrying Portuguese for Portuguese, remains more than stable, or remains quite extreme in the Caribbean, at least in Jamaica, and I suspect for the rest of the Caribbean as well. Now, but here's the thing. While at the same time that they have this kind of like insistence on endogamy, they're also living in a slave society wherein it is socially acceptable to live with or cohabit with women of color who are disempowered. And that takes a lot of forms. So most of the times when Jews mention a mistress, or a woman of color with whom they had children, it seems to be a case of a single man who, for whatever reason, didn't want to get married, maybe because of material reasons, because then he would be required to give 1/3 of the estate to a wife. So that could be one of the reasons. Technically speaking, there are no anti-miscegenation laws in Jamaica, so you could marry a woman of color if you wanted to. So those are most of the cases. But some cases you have of married Jewish men who also have mistresses with women of color. And in some of those cases, it seems to be a case of a surrogate mother. So a case where children didn't survive, or where they didn't have children, so they had children with a woman of color instead. So it's really important to realize that some of these are cases of rape, because, and some of them might have been long-term monogamous relationships, or a case of like pileg shot or something like that, where they had legal status. In some cases, you could see a woman converted to Judaism, or there was some coercion to make sure that the children remained identified as Jewish. So this is what this is the creolization process of the Jews in the Caribbean. And by the end of the 18th century, I don't know if I would say most, but let's say a very large segment of the Jewish community in the Caribbean, very large, are people of color. I think most people who are born from these kind of relationships don't identify as Jewish, but many do. And in Suriname, you even have a actual communal, an actual confraternity, the Darche Yesharim, which is made up of only mulatto Jews of color, that want to assert their own independence from the communal board. Now, I mean, this isn't so hard to understand, I think, from a halachic point of view, because for one thing, Portuguese Jews, a lot of them had very different notions about what makes family than what we would consider acceptable within rabbinic confines. Because they had been, if you were exposed to the Bible and that's all you knew was the Bible, you might have thought that, having pileg shot or concubines or something wasn't a particularly illegal problem. And this was true in the Ottoman world too, where you find it was actually quite common for Jews to kind of purchase Black Sea slaves and live with them as sex slaves, and that was in some ways accepted by the rabbinate. It's not exactly against Jewish law. So there was so they were living in a society where it was kind of socially accepted, and B, whereby there's a lot of Jewish precedent for having concubinage and surrogacy, and all of these things combined to create a new sort of class of Jews of color. And so we want to be really careful when we're talking about the Caribbean, not to overly conflate whiteness with Jewishness, because one of the deep entanglements of the Jews with free people of color is that so many free people of color in the Caribbean identified in some way as being Jewish.
Right. It's really fascinating. And so that you talk about that. And also, as mentioned, there are a number of appendices in the book, which are very interesting. So not only throughout the book do you explain these wills, but there are excerpts from wills. You have excerpts from selected Jamaican Jews. You have here actually Creole Jewish family, David Abov, Pardo, if I'm pronouncing it right. There's actually a will of Ashkenazi. We talked about Chaim Cohen, where you explain who he was, and there's a long will translated to English. So that you can actually read the wills in the book, and it's really, like I said, I found the book fascinating when I read it. So I'll put a link in the show's notes to the book where people can purchase it. And thank you, Professor Mirvis, for coming to join.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Nachi. I really appreciate being here. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you.